Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the music composition in Dr. Death with music composers Nick Chuba and Leopold Ross. And I love the fact that you also both worked on the first season. And so when you first came on board with the series and were working with Patrick McManus in season 1, what were kind of the most helpful tools or conversations or viewpoints that he was giving you? Because the show is such a specific tone, and I feel like what you've done with the music is so specific to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first came onto the project and we spoke with Patrick, we talked a lot about focusing on the tragedy rather than the horror, so to speak, because we felt like that would be a more emotional arc for the audience. They would really feel for these characters, you know what I mean? So it was more about kind of avoiding it becoming torture porn, kind of.
Right, because I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity in the way that this series approaches telling these stories, especially recognizing that there are people alive today who were impacted by the stories that we're telling on screen. And so how has that impacted the choices that you've made in terms of the music and the way that you're thinking about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the first season, we used a lot of cello because it could be tragic sounding and also scary, and, you know, it could be the victim's character or the doctor's character. And we took a sort of similar approach in season 2, but using the human voice and breath, because it's all about, you know, the throat and breathing. And so I think our approach was similar and focusing on the characters in that way. Yeah.
I love that point that you just brought up about, you know, human breath and breathing, and did the fact that kind of essentially, like, as the show progresses, we're watching characters who are literally struggling to breathe. Did that kind of shift the like pacing that you wanted for some of the music as the episodes progressed in the story?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, again, when we first started season 2, Ashley Michelle Hoban was very keen on this idea of implementing breath. And for us, I think it was a really kind of exciting, creative concept, because there's so many kind of aspects to breath that you don't really, I mean, no one really thinks about breath until you stop breathing. You know what I mean? But there's so many like different rhythms, you know, and the panicked breath or the kind of breath when you're trying to calm yourself down. So there's a lot of different tempos there that we felt were interesting to explore, you know.
And in terms of figuring out what you wanted the instruments to be that were going to be more in the foreground on this season, kind of how did you set about figuring out what you wanted that particular sound to be as well?
Well, I think Ashley brought up the idea of the breath, and that was like a great starting point. And then we recorded all different types of breathing we could think of, sort of like slow, labored breathing, fast, rhythmic sort of stuff. And then we would try and composite pieces out of those and use it almost, I think we landed on sort of a lot of the breath is serving as sort of a rhythmic element and helping propel the scenes. And then there are some moments where it's very slow, sort of almost just like a texture that's happening in the background. But it's always in the score. So subconsciously, it's hopefully evoking something.
I know, I was also going back and watching the first episode, and I love the fact that it's kind of the first time that we see anything in the medical space, that there's already this sense of tension, and we don't know why yet, because we haven't been introduced to Dr. Ramírez in the story. And so how did you set about kind of like building these elements of tension kind of at the beginning, because obviously it increases over time.
We want to kind of like keep certain tentpole sounds from season 1, you know, because we felt like we're still within the Dr. Death universe, even though it's a completely separate story. So there's certain sounds that we felt indicate the world of Dr. Death and the tone of Dr. Death. So we kind of tried to implicate those within season 2, and a lot of thematic melodies we also tried to kind of bring over.
What were some of the specific sounds that you wanted to bring over from season 1?
There's a sort of bending noise sound that we sort of use.
I love it.
I don't know how to.
I think it's the first sound in the show.
It's the first sound you hear in season 2, and I believe it's the last sound you hear in season 1 as well. But that was always the kind of indicator of the man himself, Dr. Death, whoever that may be. So that's in there. And then, wow, what other instruments did we bring over?
Yeah, we brought over like the themes in season 1 of like the victims theme that we then had singers sing. It used to be on a cello in season 1, and now we had it played on voice. And there's that one, and then there's a piece called Scrubbing In, which is sort of like the Dr. Dunch theme in season 1, and then that's also cello, and we replaced that with voice. And a lot of the drums we replaced with breathing sounds and stuff like that.
And I love the fact with music composition, especially when you're doing it for a series, that you have this ability to kind of create these callbacks. Because once we hear certain sounds at the beginning, we've built an emotional landscape. And so how do you set about using those moments where you're like, okay, maybe we're on episode 6, but if we use this sound, it's going to remind the audience of how they felt watching something in episode 1.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, how do we go about that? I mean, what do you think?
I don't know. It's hard.
Like we just do it. It's magic.
It takes a while. I think you're kind of writing and putting things against the picture, and then it's on you to then be restrictive about. You're not just, you want to see the forest and not the trees, sort of like. So you might have a bunch of pieces of music that work really great, but if they don't tie together in a thematic way, it's not really doing its job. So then you're trying to look for those things that you can connect throughout the show.
And there's such an art form in the fact that, you know, there's moments in the show where there's slightly longer pieces that are kind of like really interspersed throughout a whole scene. And then there's moments where you almost just want like a few notes to evoke something. And so how do you set about finding the difference between those spaces for yourselves?
I think a lot of it is a dialogue with the showrunner and Patrick. Both Patrick and Ashley, I think, have a good sensibility in terms of understanding that music is at its most powerful when it's not just wallpapered across the whole show. You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of a dialogue between us of them having their instinct and then us kind of massaging their instinct and saying, oh, let's, you know, stretch this out, or let's pull everything away here, you know.
Yeah, they definitely think about music as a really important part of the show. So they came to us, you know, they often come before they start shooting, or we'll get the script and sort of write based on that and then send it to them, and then they're listening while they're shooting and editing with our sketches. And so they prioritize the music in a way that is really helpful.
And I love that point as well about not having the music just be a wallpaper that's like constant throughout. And so are you having just as many conversations with them about where are the moments of silence going to be? Because it kind of makes the music land differently at certain points if maybe we haven't heard any for a few minutes.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of dialogue around that, but there's also, I think with Patrick in particular, there was a lot of like understanding of how little music there needed to be in some ways in order to make an impact.
And when you first start working on a show like this and on a season, is it helpful to kind of entrench yourself with the scripts, or is it more about having just creative conversations at the beginning to get a sensibility and then looking at the footage once they start filming?
I mean, I think we kind of have a way of working, which I don't know how other people do, but we tend to like try and get as much information as we can up front. So let's get the scripts, let's have a conversation with the showrunner, let's like get their Bible, if they have that, of any kind of visual references, and sort of like then let our imagination run with those elements, I would say. And then kind of like generate initial ideas just based off our sort of imagination, essentially, and try and get those ideas over to them as early as possible so that they can then pass through those and like connect with something, hopefully.
Yeah.
And were there specific kind of like Bible or reference points for season 2 that they were able to give you early on that were helpful?
Ashley mentioned a lot of Italian films that are more romantic, and I think that's definitely one of the key things, tones that's different than the first season, is that there's like this romance element, and that introduced sort of like a new palette for us to bring into the show and like new themes for that part of the story. So I think that was a good jumping off point. I think that's the only real influence she mentioned.
It was that and the breath. Those were the kind of
Yeah.
main touchstones.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because obviously the story took place a few years ago, but it's not a true period piece by any means. Was it helpful at all to think about, you know, what were kind of like some of the sounds that would have been a little bit more at the foreground at that specific time period, or not at all because it's so recent?
I think we were kind of relying on Michael Hill, who's the music supervisor, to really set the kind of period and place. He's an excellent music supervisor. He's able to kind of like put you in a time period with some very smart musical choices of like things playing in the cafe or whatever, music that they've got on in the hospital. So I think we kind of leaned on him to give the period more than the music that we made.
That's great. You know, and there's kind of two strands of the story because you have everything that's happening within the hospitals and within the medical field, and then you have everything that is happening in Dr. Ramírez's personal life and his relationship that's blossoming and growing and then becoming very suspicious for many reasons. And so did you want to kind of differentiate the sound of those two narratives?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a certain salesman aspect to him that we were trying to tap into, and there's one piece of music that we started trying to make it sound like a car commercial, almost like he's selling you, especially when he's doing his presentations about his brilliant new technology. We want it to feel almost like too sweet, and maybe like there's just something wrong underneath all of it. So yeah, that was one sort of thing we were definitely going for with him.
And you mentioned before that obviously part of the process is, you know, going back and forth a lot. So they're still shooting, you're starting to create some of these pieces and then kind of getting them to respond and react to it. How do you feel like a lot of the pieces that you were composing kind of really evolved and grew just through that constant back and forth that you had throughout the series with each other?
Yeah, it's always like whenever we initially deliver ideas, it's rare that they remain in that form, you know what I mean? It's often a case of like, we might throw them a bunch of ideas and they might gravitate to one aspect of an idea, and then we'll kind of take that back and sort of mold it, and we might do several different mutations of that same thing that they kind of seem to connect with, and you know, and then we're off and running. So it's very much, I would say, like, things are always mutating.
Yeah, and when you deliver music before and like while they're shooting and they start editing, they often place pieces that maybe you thought were for a certain part of the script, and they'll put it in a completely new area that you weren't thinking about, and it leads to that being a theme for that person or context or whatever. And that's sort of like the fun part, I'd say.
And are you working closely at all with the sound department as well? Because obviously the sound design of any given episode is also going to kind of influence what you're doing.
Sometimes I wish we were, but to be honest, we aren't.
I mean, we're definitely conscious of it.
Yeah.
When we get the picture, we're like trying to stay out of the way if we know that it's going to be leaning on the sound design, but there's definitely cool things we could be doing. Yeah.
And in terms of the directors on the series, I love that you had Jennifer Morrison working on she directed 4 of the episodes in this season. She also directed on the first season and was a producer on this season as well. And so what was that creative collaboration and working with her as a director?
To be honest, we mainly communicated with Ashley. Yeah. I don't recall any directors being involved. But that's generally, when you're working in episodic TV, that seems to be the case. Like it's rare that we'll be communicating with a director of an episode. It's mainly just dealing with the showrunner.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in terms of the different pieces that you were working on, are there particular pieces or moments in the series that felt like real creative challenges that you had to kind of get in there and figure out?
I would probably say episode 5. The one,
yeah,
I don't know if we were recording at that time, but there's episode 5 is one of the most sort of, I would say, horrific and intense episodes. So it was sort of was a challenge in sort of like the length of time that you had to continue this sort of spiraling degradation of someone's life.
Yeah, and it was almost totally separate from a lot of the other storylines, so it needed its own sort of world to exist in. So it was like new pieces are being thrown at this character that comes in, and it was definitely tough. And it's so horrific when you watch it.
Yeah.
You don't need music to add anything to that. It would be easy to just write a bunch of dissonant music, and it would be cheap to sort of just put that there. But it was more about getting at the emotional core of the character, which is harder, for sure.
I also, with the amount of projects that you've both worked on and everything that you've done throughout your careers, I love that in terms of getting to that point creatively, that it's really just the wealth of your previous experience kind of coming into play. On working on this project, were there particular previous things that you'd worked on where you were just like, oh, that experience came in really valuable, or I came up with this idea because of something that I'd been working on or thinking about for this thing in the past?
I think mainly season 1 informed it pretty heavily, thematically, and also just in knowing their taste and everything, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. Season 1 was definitely a good touchstone. Again, in terms of like knowing what's too much, in the sense of, like when you're showing the guts and all that kind of stuff, you don't also need some kind of, like, as Nick mentioned, some sort of dissonant horror music. I think it's more interesting to kind of go against that.
Yeah, I think the pieces that you've composed for this are kind of like so beautifully done and in a way that really enhances the storytelling. So, congratulations on an amazing second season, and thank you so much for sharing all of this.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.